Welcome back to the Fullerton College Pre-Press class. This is hopefully the last video in the PIA 5.2 of the training manual. And we're taking a look now at web-fed versus sheet-fed presses and the types of papers they need. When we last left off, we were talking about the not at all toilet paper looking rolls of webs of paper, although they can be bigger than a car on some of the larger web presses, versus the sheet-fed presses, which pick up stacks of paper. Let's look at these in a bit more detail and hopefully finish this out in this video. Don't you boop me. Let's scroll. Okay, they see me scrolling. Sheet-fed presses, just like it says, it wants to use pre-cut sheets of paper that are already cut to the size that the press can handle, or a size the press can handle. Many presses can handle up to a maximum size, but many sizes smaller. That being said, as a good pre-press person, your job will probably be to fit as many copies of something in there as possible at once to reduce press time. On a sheet-fed press, here's a good little diagram. You have a feeder stack and it pulls the paper in and it runs them out and drops it onto a delivery stack on the other side. The rest of everything else you're looking at, the blankets, inking, dampening, plate cylinders, and impressions, all of those are all a standard press unit. And once again, as kind of a review, you need one of those per color of ink that an offset press is running. So the important part here is that the feeder picks up individual sheets and passes them one at a time through the press, and it prints that page and puts it onto the delivery pile on the other side. The web press. In this case, a web is referring to the long roll of paper. I think of them as roll presses, but that is incorrect and wrong language. And even if I think that, before I talk to anybody who knows about printing, I make sure I translate that word. Anyways, web presses use a web, and a web is a big long roll, or a big spool, if you will. On a web press, the feeding system on the left there, called the unwind, has a giant roll and then a section of small rollers. You see the paper going up and down and up and down and up and down between, and that festoon of rollers allows it to change roll on the back, because you don't want to stop the press unless you have to. So you can continue to print on the paper. Those rollers in the unwind move closer and closer together, and all that extra distance that was made by going up and down between them gets to run through the press while you put a new roll on the back and splice it on. There are also far more exciting splicer units out there that will move things on or automatically put new paper on, but that's not a part of this course yet. We'll get to that later. Sheeting paper. Sheeting means cutting from a roll down to sheets. Paper that has been sheeted is in sheet form. Sheet happens. Sorry, I had to. My wife is cringing at me. My job here is done, but we still have a few more pages to talk about. So one of the things about sheeting paper is when you cut fresh paper, this is similar to cutting the fresh lumber versus aged lumber if you're buying at a hardware store. While it still has some dampness to us, it's still new, it's a little bit bigger. Paper, by the way, does not stay the same size all the time. Paper being such an organic material, paper being made out of wood and having liquid content to it, even when you think it's all the way dry, actually changes in the weather. It expands and contracts when it gets wet and dry. When it gets hot and cold, it changes sizes. Fresh paper starts out bigger than the final paper, and it goes down a little bit. So if people talk about getting green paper, they mean it in the green lumber sense of it hasn't fully dried yet. Green paper means, watch out, it's not going to stay this size. You need to pre-trim stock for sheet-fed systems, including the digital systems that run it sheet-fed. And trim down to whatever size it's going to be. A lot of times you will still buy parent size sheets in their huge, like 25 by 38 inch sizes, for instance. And then at your print shop, you'll chop it down on a guillotine cutter. Vive la France. And you'll take the smaller pieces and run those through presses. When you bring it down, a huge box of this stuff, a case of parent sheet, is too heavy to easily move or easily lift. So they call it a lift when you pick up a smaller handful of paper, which is as much as you can lift without hurting yourself. So for trimming, a cutter operator will put the paper against the back of the cutter, and they will measure it just slightly smaller than the requested size of stock. Because you want to make sure that you're able to get rid of all the uneven sizes. If you cut actually to the size you need, so the depth is slightly smaller, meaning the size would be a little bit bigger. You always start out a little bit larger than you think you need when you're trimming large sheets to smaller sheets, because the edges aren't quite so even from the green paper when you first buy it. So you also have something called the wild side, which is the side of all the ragged edges versus the side you've cut, which is the clean side. Anyways, custom paper sizes. Most of the time people work with standard size paper, like 8.5 by 11 if you're an amateur, 11 by 17 to 12 by 18 if you're a professional on a digital press, or a little bit larger sizes for different various offset presses. But you can get weird custom cut sizes. You can get unusual sizes. As an example, for when we're able to visit campus, we have a couple pallets of a weird size of paper because somebody ordered it and then couldn't use it. And you can't exactly return it if you had it custom made, which is why we have 11.5 by 17-inch premium paper. And we have around 18,000 sheets of it because somebody ordered 3 pallets of this stuff and then realized it was the wrong size. Bad for them, good for me. So most of the time you buy it and sell it in standard sizes, unless you really desperately need it at a strange size for a specific project or specific requirements. So you can also buy these. I mean, the rolls themselves come in standard widths, which makes standard sizes easy to cut from them. And standard paper comes out as certain sizes, and these standard sizes have intended uses. Typically, they're large enough to print one or multiple pages on them and still have space around the edge for things like trim marks, fold marks, color bars, targets for color management, and all sorts of little things that people who aren't in printing don't appreciate necessarily, but hopefully you guys will soon. So again, the parent size is pretty standard for some of these things. So if you get text or offset, you're typically getting 23 by 35 inch. And if you're ordering cover stock, you're getting 25 by 38. That's funny because the basis weight for cover stock uses a smaller size than this. Can they please just be consistent? Do you guys see why I like grammage? Sorry to go back to grammage. There are some sizes that don't include extra paper. Typically speaking, a lot of people like getting final products in letter size, 8.5 by 11. If you buy it at that size, there's no space for anything extra. You just fit what you can inside the printable area and you're done. But if you want to be able to do multiple sheets and have bleed or any sort of extra marks necessary to get it a good cut, you need to give extra space. So it's a little bit bigger than you would have otherwise thought. A bust cut means you took a large sheet and you cut it down into smaller pieces without losing anything. If you're doing bond, like 20-pound bond paper comes originally in 17 by 22, and you cut that into, you do 2 cuts, 1 in each direction, you end up with 4 sheets of 8.5 by 11. It's very efficient, but you're not able to do bleed or any of those other color bar things. Okay, do some paper classifications here, and then we'll be done. So business and bond paper is 17 by 22. This is what turns into letter size without any extras, and it's mainly for things like making copies. It's okay for writing on in pen and ink. It's okay for writing on pencil. It's not the best for anything. It's kind of cheap, and it fits into desktop printers. Cover stock, typically 20 by 26 on this slide, is strong and durable. Sometimes it has a finish, sometimes it does not, but it's thicker. Coated paper, I've never heard them called enamels. That might be an East Coast terminology. Coated paper, 25 by 38, because it's still like text or offset paper, even if it's coated. You know, as we talked about, has a coating on it to make it smoother, shinier, brighter, whiter, better for printing on. It can be coated on one or both sides. And uncoated of the same size is called offset or book. It still has a lot of opacity. It's still better than bond. It's stronger, has better strength properties, but it's a little bit cheaper than the coated stuff because the coating processes cost more time and more money to make. Let's talk about the single most important thing in my whole class, bleed. Bust cuts are fine if you're just doing something with a white border, like a form letter. But if you ever want it to print to the edge of the paper, you must use something called bleed. Bleed means you print a little bit bigger than you need and then cut off the outside edges. The best way to think about this is sandwiches. If you have your mom make a sandwich with no crust, how does she do it? Can she go out to the store and buy bread that has no crust on it? By the way, no cheating and talking about those frozen Uncrustables. They're delicious, but they ruin my analogy. If you're actually making a sandwich, you have to cut the crust off because the process of making bread makes a crust. You can't get crustless. So in order to make printing that goes to the edge of the paper, we can't actually do that. What we do is we print bigger than we want and we cut off the crust, the edges. And that makes us have it look like we printed to the edge. The standard size for a bleed in the United States is 1/8 of an inch. Some places can work with a little bit less if they have very tight controls on their printing and cutting, but no one will ever complain about getting 1/8 of an inch because that's what you should expect to see on a print file. If you are in a metric loving part of the world, which is literally anywhere but here, it is, I believe, 3 millimeters. And 3 millimeters is basically 1/8 of an inch. It's very close because 25 millimeters is about an inch. So 3 is about, yeah, exactly an eighth. So anyways, this also allows some margin of error. You could, in one hand cut perfect copy, take a postcard and print it exactly the size you want, take a ruler and a knife and very carefully trim the edges so no white paper remains on the outside edge and you don't lose any of the color of your print and you get it exactly on that line. Print 1,000 copies, put them in a stack and put them through a guillotine and your accuracy goes down. So the bleed allows a little bit of slop because no machine is perfect. The more processes you go through, the more chances something's going to go wrong. So you got to allow room for those mistakes and machine errors. There's also something called a gripper margin. This one goes back to my Greek mythology, the bits that I know of it. You guys heard of Achilles, or Achille if you're French? The story of Achilles, the Greek warrior who is granted immortality and imperviousness to battle wounds by being dipped in a special river by his mother. She held him by his ankle and dipped him in the water, and he came out and nothing could hurt him, except the part of his ankle where she held her hand over it and his ankle didn't get the water on it. The paper going through a press has to be grabbed by something. It just doesn't magically float through. There's rollers or grips or little tiny metal grabby hands that hold onto the edge of the paper and pull it through the press. That's called the gripper. And the gripper margin allows for those little hands to hold onto your paper. And if you ever held something and tried to spray paint it, you'll know where your hand is, you can't paint. You're going to leave a handprint there. You need to leave a space that's not there. So the gripper margin on a press is a part of the paper you can't use. There's going to be a couple parts in this class where we talk disappointingly about the parts of the paper you don't get to use, about the tax you have to pay to the process. Here's a good picture of it. The gripper are those little metal fingers, and they hold on to the edge of the paper. They try to make them as small as possible, but they still do mean there's a part of your paper you can't print on. Depending on the press, they're either larger or smaller. It can be between 1/4 inch to up to 1/2 inch of paper on that sheet you're not able to use. So when you're thinking about how big can I print, it's not the size of the parent sheet. It's the size of the parent sheet minus expenses. And by expenses, I mean your gripper, your margins, your bleed, and other things like that. There's all this space you're not allowed to use that the printer can't handle. Yet again, the gripper is non-printable. Also, grippers, by grabbing a little metal fingers, can leave marks on your paper called gripper marks. Some people are okay with this, some are not. Some papers show it, some don't. You need to be able to not print and not need the gripper margin, even if it's all white bordered and goes without pictures over the edge. If you're using a gripper press and you don't want those marks to be seen and your client's very picky, you have to make sure that you're able to trim that off or not need it in the final size. Here's a press sheet layout. I like this a lot. It shows you the taxes, as I like to call them, that you have to pay. The job area in the middle with the 1, 2, 3, 4 are 4 pages of a signature that's going to fold into a book or a magazine. You have to leave space for the gripper on the outside. You have to leave space for the bleed. Remember, bleed's 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to drill this on you guys. Whenever someone says the word bleed, you're going to think 1/8 of an inch as your automatic response. There's some print targets on there, some fold marks, some prop marks, and then the color bar for maintaining color consistency across the print along the top there. All those things get printed on the page outside of what's finally turned into the book and just get trimmed off and let's hope recycled. I'll go with recycled. Anyways, thanks for listening. We'll talk again soon.